Hi guys, today I'm going to be doing a Copic paper comparison video, or basically what kind of papers work with Copics the best. Yeah, so I've been meaning to do this video for quite some time now since there have been people requesting for this, but I wanted to wait until I got a little bit more paper variants. So as you can see here, I have 6 different kinds of papers. I have regular bond paper, laser printer paper, bleeder comic book paper, which is the paper I use the most, Copic bleedproof marker pad, letraset bleedproof marker pad, and Arches hot press watercolor paper. Now, I haven't tried regular bond paper with the markers yet. Prior to this video, I've mostly used the deleter comic book paper and some laser printer paper for like when I want to just experiment because the paper isn't that expensive. And I've tried mixing the markers with watercolor and hot press watercolor paper before, so I think they work quite fine. Now, for the bleed-proof marker pads, I actually bought these way before I got the comic book paper, but I didn't really use it a lot at that time. But it's going to be exciting to see how they all work. So I'm going to be conducting various tests like how the markers look like when they're applied with a dry stroke, how they look like when they're blended out, and with the blender marker, or if you want to make various gradations and what pens work with it. So I'm just going to do all of the comparative studies at once here, and then I'm going to zoom in later and kind of discuss how the markers look differently on each kind of paper. Okay, so I did the following tests. First off is just a dry stroke, just how you would normally color with a Copic marker. The next one is I apply the color first and then I blend it out with the blender marker to see how light you can go, since the blender marker is handy for erasing mistakes or possibly if you want to soften a hard edge. And then I also did a gradation, like what you normally do when you blend different colors. And then here at the side, I have one where I used some uni pins, but you can use any multi-liner you want that's alcohol proof. And after doing in the lines, I color in to see how the paper absorbs the ink of the liner, because some people really like to do the line art first before coloring the pens. And then the next one is just with the Pentel brush pen, this one, because some people also like using brush pens to do the line art instead of tech pens. Now, do take note that I've only used 2 different kinds of inking supplies, so it depends on what inking supply you're using, as some are unfortunately not alcohol proof, so they will tend to smear, and sometimes it's not the paper's fault itself. So do search some reviews if you plan on buying any pens, or try it out first before working on a piece. So I'm going to go more in depth about each of the papers, and I'm going to explain my findings as I go. Okay, first off, we have regular bond paper, or regular copy paper, as I like to call it. So the papers perform quite decently. As you can see, it preserves the dry strokes. There's not a lot of feathering. And the blender marker performs decently. It can lighten up the spot considerably, but do take note to be careful when you're blending, because sometimes if you do a messy or rushed job, it can end up like this. Of course, if this is the effect you want, it's perfectly fine. And then as for blending, it's okay, but there's quite a bit of harsh transitions, even though I went back and forth with the lighter color markers. So that's something to be taken note of. I think it's partly because of the texture of the paper. It's not entirely smooth, and also because of the thinness. It preserves the inking lines quite well for both the uni pen and the brush pen. So the paper quickly absorbs the ink. And if you check at the back, bleeding is really bad on this paper. But with most papers, the bleeding is going to be really bad because these are alcohol markers. So the regular bond paper is probably the cheapest out of everything and the easiest to get. And it's decent, I guess. Not the best, but quite okay. And then laser printer paper. Now for the laser printer paper, it also preserves dry strokes quite well. it doesn't lighten as severely as regular bond paper. It's only just a little bit. It's quite subtle, but it's okay, I guess. You can build it up more and erase back and forth. Blending, it's considerably better than the regular bond paper for me. There's actually more of a transition, although you can see there's still a bit of the really harsh gaps. But, this is a bigger area, so if it were a smaller area, it'd be more okay. And for the inking, there's just a little bit of smudges for the uni pin, and it's not that visible on camera, but in person you can see it. Now, this is because I didn't let the uni pins dry on time, and because the laser printer paper surface is actually smoother than the regular bond paper, so that's why the ink takes longer to dry on it. But if you allow the pen to dry longer, then it's not gonna smear because the ink has already settled into the paper. And for the brush pen, it's the same problem. There's a little bit of smearing, although it's not as severe as the other papers later on that smeared so much. So yeah, for me, I think the laser printer paper is the best budget alternative, and it's not that hard to acquire either. And then next is the Leader comic book paper, which is the paper I use a lot. And it handles dry strokes quite well, no feathering, and it also lightened up considerably with the colorless blender. Blending is quite good on this paper. There's still a bit of hard edges, but yeah, it's the least severe out of all of the papers. And then the inks actually dried quite fast. There's no smearing at all. Oh, and I forgot, for the laser printer paper, I didn't show the back. But here, as you can see, it also bleeds quite severely. Although compared to the regular bond paper, I think this bleeds a little less. Just a little. I still recommend putting a paper underneath it, so that you don't end up wrecking the surface underneath. But yeah, this is the Leader comic book paper. Dries well, blends well. The only thing about this paper is that it's quite difficult to find depending where you live. Now, in the Philippines, Artillery Philippines sells it, and that's where I get my paper. In Japan, this is very easy to find. And in America, I think you can get it from... I can't remember the name of the website, but I think you can get it from the Leader's online store. And here is the bleeding. It's not as severe as the previous two because the paper is a little bit thicker and smoother. Yeah. Oh, and one thing to note about the Leader paper is that I'm not sure if it's visible on camera, but yeah, as you can see, this comic book paper is considerably more yellow than the laser printer and bond paper, and actually even the marker pads themselves too. This paper is a lot yellower. So I think that's something to take note. If you don't like yellowish tone paper, you might not like this. But if you like smooth paper, and you'd want to ink a lot and you'd want to work fast, this is great paper. So the next one is the Copic bleedproof marker pad. So the Copic bleedproof marker pad, it's very thin, also like the letraset paper pen. It's very thin and it handled dry strokes okay. The blender marker does not lighten the color at all. It would be very hard to erase mistakes or soften edges with this paper. It doesn't take to blending very well. Like, compared with this paper, as you can see, the color looks quite faded on this paper. Here it looks very vibrant, even if the paper is yellowish. And okay, I'm not sure if you can see. I'll just try to bring it closer. Yeah, here it's like the color is more pure in this paper, and then here you can see there's a lot of white dots showing. And I think that's due to the nature of the paper and how the ink doesn't blend as well on this paper. Sorry for the loud noise. I think some neighbors are doing some welding of metals or something. I'm not sure. Yeah. And the ink is also smeared a bit, although it's not that noticeable. The color just looks a bit grayish, so you can tell that it's smeared a bit. And for the brush pen, it's smeared a lot. Now, I'm not sure if this pad is just doesn't like brush ink, or if it needs time to absorb it. But I think the ink really settles in this paper because the brush pen is really Copic proof. And I don't think it should take that long to dry. The ink really sits on top of this paper. That's why it's also hard to blend. But the good thing about this paper is that it doesn't make a mess. Like, there's a bit of bleeding here, but marker paper specialty is that it doesn't bleed to the next surface below it. Because there's always going to be this protective coating so the ink doesn't spill over. Now, I think that the good side to marker paper is that it's very convenient. You don't have to worry about the alcohol bleeding into whatever you're coloring on top of because there's always going to be that plastic coating shielding the next surface below it. But one downside to that is that you can only use one side of this paper. So you have to take care to use the right side because I've colored on the wrong side of marker paper before and it was not pleasant at all. It's a really bad experience. And then next I'm going to go over the letraset bleedproof marker pad, which performed quite similarly to the Copic marker pad. It took dry strokes quite well. It kind of reacts to the blender marker more. It got lighter. And for me, it blends better on the letraset bleedproof marker pad compared to the Copic. This is the letraset, this is the Copic. To me, in real life, it looks like it kind of blended a bit better. But this one has more... No, actually, this one looks like it blended better, yeah. And then this one has more vibrant color, in real life. And as with both papers, the ink smeared so much on the tech pens. The Unipen smeared less on the bleedproof marker pad, and the brush pen also smeared a lot. But I think the ink dries faster on the letraset bleedproof marker pad. And also bleeds at the back, but it does not transfer to the next surface it's under. Just like the Copic bleedproof marker pad. And then lastly, we have the Arches hot press watercolor paper. Now the Arches hot press watercolor paper, it takes dry strokes quite well. No feathering as well. Actually, no feathering for any of the paper, which is quite good. Since if you use cheaper and, the really cheap and rough paper, sometimes the ink tends to feather out and it looks really unpleasant. Blender marker reacts quite well. It lightens up considerably. The blending is gorgeous on this paper. My transition here was kind of rough since the color is really dark, but here, as you can see, it blends so well. I think because it's hot press watercolor paper, so the surface is really smooth, but it's really fine, so that allows better blending. And it's quite thick, very, very thick. And for the ink, there's very, very minimal smearing, as in you really can't see it unless you look super close to the paper in real life. And that's because the ink was colored as soon as it was put down there. But if you let it dry a bit longer, it's not going to smear at all. And for the brush pen, there's a lot of smearing because the pigment kind of collects and sits on the paper. It won't absorb anymore. But I think if you let the ink dry a little longer, it's gonna be less severe. And the paper also bleeds at the back, but it's not going to transfer into the next surface yet because the paper is really thick. But it's possible to transfer because there's no protective coating, unlike the marker pads. Now, as for this paper, I really like it. It blends super well, but there's two bigger downsides to this paper, and one is that it sucks your markers really dry. Like when I was coloring this swatch, it was so dry and I felt that it was kind of hard to apply it at first. And that's because this is watercolor paper and it's meant to absorb a lot of water. So it also absorbs a lot of the ink. Now this is bad for your markers because if you don't have refills, you'll run out of ink easily. So you'll end up having to spend more on ink in the long run. Of course, Copic refills are economic. So if you buy one refill, you can refill your marker more than 10 times depending on the model. But still, it's quite an expensive practice to do compared to the other papers. And also, I'm using Arches hot press watercolor paper, which is one of the most expensive watercolor papers ever, because I ran out of the hot press watercolor paper I'm using, which is more affordable. But yeah, hot press watercolor paper just tends to err on the more expensive side. Even if you get the 185 GSM or the lighter paper, it's still going to be quite pricey compared to the other papers. But that said, I think if you have the money to spend, then the results are well worth it. So yeah, just to recap, this is all of the paper we've tested. Regular bond paper, laser printer paper, Deviantart comic book paper, letraset bleedproof marker pad, Copic bleedproof marker pad, and Arches hot press watercolor paper. These two on the top are the most budget friendly options. The regular bond paper and the laser printer. They're also really easy to access. You could buy these anywhere at a national bookstore in the Philippines or in your other supply stores abroad. For me, the balanced option is the Deviantart comic book paper. It's one of the best quality and it's priced reasonably if you're in Japan or the Philippines. I'm not sure in America if it would be more expensive due to import tax. Performs really well, but one downside to this paper and also to the Arches hot press watercolor paper is that they're both considerably more yellow than these paper. So if you're not a fan of yellow tone paper, well, it's not super yellow, it's a bit more on the cream side, but if you're not a fan of cream paper, you won't like these. Now, the letraset bleedproof marker pad and the Copic bleedproof marker pad here below, I think they're more convenient options and they're better for designers, or if you're planning on laying down quick sketches and colors and you're not really looking to blend and render, then these papers are really convenient, and especially because the ink won't bleed to the other side of the surface because of the protective coating that marker papers have. But the downside to this paper is that it's very thin. Both of these paper are very, very thin, and if you're not a fan of thin paper, you won't like it. And you can't use the back side of the paper, so if you end up accidentally using the wrong side of the marker paper, then you're kind of screwed. Yeah, and it's not that forgiving for blending, and you can't erase mistakes as well. And the ink takes quite a bit of time to dry on it. But it definitely has its upside, so it kind of makes it sound like I'm saying it's a bad paper, but it's not. It's very convenient. And I also quite like it too for its own purposes. So yeah, budget alternatives, very convenient and fast drying, and these are the nicest papers for me for blending. And the hot press watercolor paper, I'd say it's the most uneconomical option out of the 6, but it gives you some of the best results for blending. So if you have the money to spend for the paper and the refills, then why not? Go for it. But if you're kind of wanting to be a bit more economical and you want to work faster, then the Deviantart comic book paper is perfect for you. And if you want to pick up some paper for practice, I just love the laser printer paper. So it blends quite decently and it's easy to get and it's cheap. Or you can also use regular bond paper. There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah, so that has been it for this week's video, and if you enjoyed it, show some love to the thumbs up down below and subscribe to my channel. I do weekly art reviews. And if I missed the kind of paper, then just comment it down below and maybe I'll do like a follow-up if I had a lot that I missed and that you wanted to see. And of course, if you have any suggestions on what you want to see next, just comment down below. So yeah, that's it, and thanks for watching!